I'm Erin Popelka. I curate must-read fiction, a community of readers and people who love fiction and love to read. I am a reader and a writer. I love fiction. I love everything about fiction. I think that life is just better with a novel in hand. I am here with my dear friend, Larina Warnock. Her introduction could go as long as this video, but we'll keep it short. Larina is a high school business teacher and also an advisor for the future business leaders of America at her high school. She is a doctoral candidate in education. She is a novelist. She is a poet. She is a mother. She also served as an editor for the journal called The Externalist, which is currently on a pause, but she did that for many years. And she's been kind enough to sit here and talk to me about reading and writing and everything that we love about reading and writing. Hi, Larina.
Hello, Erin. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Thank you for being here. This is so great. So I really wanted to kind of start, kind of with your work with The Externalist as an editor. I know you saw lots of different stories. I know that The Externalist was looking for a specific type of story. You got stories, you got poetry, you got essays. Let's start there. What was it about some fictional stories that made you want to publish the piece?
So The Externalist, like you mentioned, it was very, very specifically focused. And we were focused on social issues, cause-related fiction, a lot of politics, but also, social justice, general social justice issues. So when I started to read a story, if it didn't fit that, even if it was a fabulous story, I couldn't publish it.
Sure.
But other fiction, when we started reading, and I read hundreds of stories throughout working with The Externalist. When we first started, I was looking for stories that really spoke to me as a reader. And so I think a lot of people read as a way out. It's an escape. And for me, with my history, it was really a way in to the world. And so I was always looking for fiction that helped me explain the world around me.
Yeah.
And helped me kind of play with ideas and think about these issues in a little bit different way. And we were called A Journal of Perspectives because we wanted to have these many, many different ways of thinking about things. And as we were publishing, I started to find what our readers really liked. And fiction wasn't the big draw to The Externalist for the first few months. Poetry actually was which is interesting because a lot of people don't read poetry, but we got far more hits on our poetry publications than we did on our fiction.
That's really interesting. Even more than the essays.
Even more than the essays at first.
Interesting, yeah.
And over time, I started to see these kind of patterns and trends and what our readers were looking for in fiction. And almost always, it started with a really, really relatable character. And they wanted a story, and when I think about it, it's really what I want in a story too. I want a story that has a character that I can root for, a character that I can understand and empathize with, a character that is flawed, but not so flawed that they remind me of myself. So our readers really were looking for something real with their characters and then the story itself. I always look for something that's really layered. And so I don't care as much about plots and subplots. If there are all these little loose ends, that doesn't, the complexity of a story doesn't really draw me and never has. But I want it to be layered in meaning.
Sure.
So if I read a story on Monday, it might mean something different to me than if I read that same story on Friday. And if I read it 5 years from now, it might mean something even different because my experiences have changed. So I want a story that relates to multiple experiences and can grow with me. I think that's why we outgrow children's books. It's because children's books really fit in this one, though they don't grow with us.
Sure.
But when we think about things like our Dr. Seuss novels and the Lorax, and those are the kinds of things that they mean something different to us over the years, and we keep coming back to them.
Right.
We're 40 years old and Dr. Seuss in it.
Yeah. He Dr. Seuss in it. I love it. We should make that like a new hashtag. Dr. Seuss in it.
Dr. Seuss in it, for sure.
So good. Do you have a favorite Dr. Seuss?
Horton Hears a Who has always been my favorite Dr. Seuss since I was really, really, really little.
Yeah.
And you know, it's interesting because now that I'm older, I can look at that and I can go, that totally fits my personality. You know, we're looking for the smallest little people, and everybody's, you know, everybody is important no matter how small or insignificant they seem in the world. And that's really my worldview.
Yeah.
So, you know, I guess maybe my favorite Dr. Seuss didn't grow with me. We just grew together in the same way.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Huh, fantastic. I remember the Lorax. The Lorax kind of comes up, but I was always like very environmentally minded. And I remember coming back to the Lorax in college, and I think we did like a Lorax reading in like the student union, you know, 'cause what you do when you're an undergrad, you read Dr. Seuss, you know.
Right? For sure.
And, yep, and so, so fascinating.
Yeah, and the Lorax is interesting just because it does touch on that really big social issue.
Yeah.
And it's almost preachy.
Almost,
you know, There's no way to get around what the message is there. It's not subtle at all, but it always hits hard.
Yeah.
And so I often wonder if there's a way to capture that, you know, as an adult writer.
Yeah.
Could I capture that heavy-handed, like, this is what I'm trying to say, take it or leave it, you know?
Right.
But I don't think anybody does it like Dr. Seuss.
I know. Yeah. And that's kind of an interesting kind of next segue. I'd love to talk about your writing. So you have written a novel for sure. You've published much poetry. You've published short fiction. You've published essays. Talk to me about your writing process and what is it about writing that, you know, keeps drawing you back?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, especially at this stage in my life, because I'm not writing a lot because I'm working on my dissertation.
Yes, you've got a big nonfiction writing deadline that's coming up.
Yeah, it's kind of huge. You know, it's a couple hundred pages. You
know, it's got to be properly cited. You can't just make it up.
Yeah, I can't just make it up. I have to stop and go, oh, that's not really what the data says, even if I think that's what the data should say.
Right.
You know, and academic writing is so much different than creative writing.
Yeah.
So, you know, for the last probably 2 years, I haven't done a lot of creative writing. What I find with poetry in particular, poetry I end up coming back to, and I was really resistant to being called a poet for a long time because I wanted to be a novelist. I wanted to be a fiction writer. And people would say, oh, you're such a fabulous poet. And I'm like, don't say that. Poets don't make money. You know, nobody knows who poets are. But over the course of my life, like tragedy is just part of the fabric of my life.
Yeah.
And poetry is something that I always come back to as a way to come back to the world when tragedy strikes. So my chapbook of poetry that was published, Guitar Without Strings, is actually, it's a memoir of me and my father. And we had a really rocky relationship, and I loved him and he loved me with everything in him, but he had problems.
Yeah.
And writing that chapbook helped me through all of that grief and helped me to kind of process, what is this that I'm feeling about the death of my father? And then in contrast, when my son passed away, I didn't write at all for like 1.5 years. And I didn't write anything. I didn't write academic. I didn't write, like, just nothing. The writing wouldn't come. But when it did come, it was poetry.
Interesting.
And so now I have this whole collection of poems that I haven't really done anything with, but that walks through that journey of Zachary from his birth to his death and the years following that.
Yeah.
So I think with poetry, it's a coping mechanism more than anything else for me. It's a way for me to process my experiences, and hopefully in the process, I'm helping someone else with their experiences, you know, if those pieces are published. But I also have, you know, stacks and stacks of stuff that, like, I hope the world never sees this ever because it's awful.
I'm sure it's not awful. I'm sure it's just very, very raw.
No, it's awful. It's really, really bad. And like my biggest fear is that I'll be remembered for like some bad poem, you know, like Rod McEwen, you know, Seasons in the Sun, and everybody goes, ah, ha, 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 and that, you know, that'll be what happens to me.
We all have a greatest fear.
We all have our greatest fear. That's
May it never come to pass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In contrast, fiction. I love writing fiction because I love writing fiction. I don't love editing fiction, and that's why I haven't published a lot of fiction, because I'll write and write and write, but as soon as I get to that editing process, I'm like, oh no. But writing fiction lets me play with things that are outside of my perspective. Mm-hmm. You know, so I write science fiction and fantasy, and some magic realism and some literary stuff. So it's really kind of all over the board. Yeah. And what always draws me is just the idea. The idea starts in my brain and it won't go away. Mm-hmm. And when it won't go away, then I know, okay, I've got to do something with this.
Yeah.
And so my novel, you mentioned my novel, and it's been, you know, in progress for however many years now, and I keep coming back to it. I don't just, you know, shelf it and go, okay, this isn't the novel, because the idea and the underlying foundation of that novel keep coming back to me as important and salient, and might help somebody else get through something, you know, so.
Yeah.
I think that's what keeps me coming back to writing. The academic writing is easier for me. Oddly enough, it's a lot easier for me to put the pieces together. There's a structure that's already defined. There are rules that you follow.
That you're supposed to follow.
You're not
supposed to break those with intention.
Right.
This is how it is, and there's a reason for it, and the reason makes sense.
Yeah, and then in fiction or poetry, either one, you know, there are all these rules, and you have to learn the rules and write by the rules, but you don't get published until you learn how to break the rules. And so and you have to think about, if I break this rule in this way, how is that going to affect my reader? Because ultimately, if you're writing for yourself, that part of it doesn't matter. But if you're writing with intention to share that work with other people, you have to be thinking about those other people and those readers.
Yeah.
And I'm very audience-minded when I write.
Yeah.
Which is hard because I don't relate well to other people. So it also maybe helps me to grow so that I can relate to other people. It forces me to try to relate to other people.
Yeah. The question of audience is a good one, because I do feel like audience is the difference between like a diary and a novel,
right?
You know, or just like musings and you know, and poetry that's published, you know, and though certainly poetry doesn't need an audience to be poetry, right? But I think there's something to getting it out in the world and knowing that it will have a reader that creates sort of almost a different medium.
It does, and I think it's important to recognize, like, we can get stuck in the trap of good writing and bad writing. Good batting and writing.
It's good. Good.
Good writing and bad writing, and you know, there are these very specific things that make a poem, and there are these very specific things that make a story work, and we can get stuck in all of that. Yeah. But what we have to try to remember is that there's so much diversity in writing because there is so much diversity in people. And so if people are very different, there's going to be an audience, you know, for what you're writing, as long as you can identify that audience. And so I teach business, and so I often will think about it in marketing terms. And when you're marketing, you don't go, I'm going to create this product for everybody, right? But we tend to think about, I'm going to create this novel for everybody. Well, you can't create a novel for everybody. So thinking about like Thomas Wolfe, you know, there may be 100 people in every 1,000-mile radius that read Thomas Wolfe, but that doesn't make him bad, and it also doesn't make him great. You know, it just means that Thomas Wolfe has a very specific audience.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Oh, fascinating. And yeah, kind of speaking of to some of your teaching, you know, kind of with business, so much of that is also storytelling, because you are trying to find that audience, which isn't everybody, but it's the people that get really excited about the thing that you're excited about because you're selling it. Right. So how do you instill that kind of storytelling piece, you know, with your students?
Well, I think teaching is about 95% acting.
Okay.
And so when I'm working with students, the very first thing is I have to get into the mindset of my audience, which is my students.
Yeah.
And, you know, they're 15 and I'm 40, and that creates some issues. They have their cell phones and they grew up with them, and I got internet in my 20s, you know, so there's some generation gaps there that first we have to cross that, and storytelling is a good way to cross those generation boundaries, because I can talk about what it was like for me and then invite them in to share how it's different and how it's changed. So then they become part of the story.
Interesting.
And that's, I think, really the key with teaching any subject is to let them become part of the story. As soon as they become part of the story, then you can help them identify, so why did you become part of this story? What is it that made you passionate about this? What is it that made you care about this? Okay, now how can you use that to find other people who are passionate about this? And so it really is about helping students self-reflect enough that they understand that their self-reflection is different from other people's self-reflection. And I think we lose that sometimes. And especially in education where we're standardizing everything, you know, we want everybody to kind of have the same content, and that's fabulous. I am not at all opposed to standardization, except in the sense that we also have to teach people how to be different and how to accept other people's differences. And as soon as you get that, then you can go, oh, so now I know why that person is using a different kind of shampoo. Now I understand why this app works for this set of people, but it doesn't work for this set of people. Oh, so, you know, the older generation isn't using the internet as much, but if I'm marketing a product that's really good for the younger generation, then I need to integrate the internet into that. And they start to understand where difference comes from. And if you understand where difference comes from, it's not as scary.
Right.
So in my marketing classes in particular, it's a great place to teach that because they have marketing research assignments. They create a product of their own, and then they go and they research it. So I had one group of students who they wanted to do, I tell them that the product does not have to be technologically real, you know, but they wanted to be able to track dreams. And so they wanted to create a machine that would track your dreams and then play them back to you, right? And they thought that elderly people would be the people who would use this the most. And they were like, because of Alzheimer's and because, you know, your memory gets, and they had very good reasons for thinking that it would be elderly people. So I'm like, okay, so now you're going to take this out there, you're going to take your idea and explain it to a bunch of people. And they came back and they were like all of the older people that we talked to were like so scared of the health effects of this. Like they really were not, but teenagers love it and they really want to be able to track their dreams. And you know, me as an adult, I'm able to go, yeah, because teenagers are selfish and they want to be able to, you know, like go back to everything that they think.
Right.
Right. But even assignments, very carefully managing assignments so that they're developing their own story.
Sure.
And then they're integrating that story, and then they have to tell that story to someone else and communicate that story to someone else. I try to spend less time talking and more time listening. But then I just, you know, I'm able to go out and tell other stories because I get so many stories from my students too.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So such a fascinating process. And I was thinking too, you know, kind of with the story of business, kind of when you were talking about it, creating a story that everybody's in. I think that's also the process of a really good novel. I think so too. That like a really good novel is a way where as readers, we're part of that story. Yeah. You know, and so I think I read a quote, you know, that the novel you finish is not the same novel that you started, you know, that like as a reader, you are part of the process of that novel, which I think is very, very true. I think so too. Yeah, I think, and they become parts of us. Yeah. Right? So if you read a book that doesn't become part of you, it probably wasn't a very good book for you. Yeah. You know? Yeah. So, and sometimes books become a deep part of us. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then we know really that we're part of that story. And you, I don't know that I've heard the full story, but you talk about you said a novel that was the reason that you went to college. Yes. So,
hello, Must Readers. We had a little tech issue. I got to the end of the memory on my phone. So we were talking, so I had just asked Larina about a book that like led her to college. That was the book that made her go to college. So we're going to get that question answered. I'm so excited to hear the story. Thank you. So tell me about the book that made you want to go to college.
So when I went to alternative school, and the alternative school was really designed for students who weren't successful in a regular general ed program, and that was not me. School was my safe place and where I could be successful and feel valued. And so I got to alternative school, and the English teacher did an incoming assessment, and she said, you know, where are you going to college? And I said, people like me don't go to college. And I felt that really, really deeply. It was deeply rooted in me. I wanted to go to college more than anything in the world. In fact, later when I met my current husband, and he said, what's one thing that you've always wanted to do? And I said, go to college. And he said, so do it. Right? So I'm like, oh, it's just that easy. Yeah, all right. But she said, well, you're way too high level for the work that other students are doing, because they're working on commas and grammar and those kinds of things. And I was already published by that point. I had published my first poem by then. And so she gave me A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving. And she gave me this assignment to read it. And she wanted me to be looking at themes and symbols throughout the book. And so I read it. And as I'm reading, I'm like making little tabs. You know, back then it was more like dog ears. And I know we're not supposed to dog ear our books, but you know, like this book was so dog eared by the end, and it was just quote after quote after quote. And the thing about A Prayer for Owen Meany was it was the first time that I had read a book that the character that I related to most was the character that was most different from everybody else, and that was Owen Meany. And in particular, if you've read the book, Owen Meany has this view of the world where faith is kind of the center of his world, and you just believe that the things around you are the way they're supposed to be, and things are going the way they're supposed to be, and you make choices, but you make choices because you believe that things are going to work out the way that they're supposed to, even if that's not the way that you want them to. And so for me, faith has always been a very deeply rooted part of my being, and I've always believed that things happen for a reason. I don't know if I could have survived the things that I've survived if I didn't believe that. But I suddenly realized, like, oh, my worldview is way different than the average person's worldview, because Owen Meany is so blatantly different. I mean, all his dialogue is in all caps, and and
he's got that crazy voice.
He's got that crazy voice, and he's so different from everybody else.
And he's like teeny weeny,
and he's tiny, and and people don't really know what to think of him. And I realized all of a sudden, like, oh, I'm really different from other people, and that's okay. And so then later, and in my TEDx talk, I talk about this experience with this English teacher who she gave me this book. It was a college level book. She gave me a college level essay. And then she actually had a college professor grade that assignment without me knowing, and then told me that it was graded by a college professor. And so all of a sudden, all these things start falling into place for me, like, oh, someone like me, maybe I could do college. And I didn't go like right away. It wasn't like I left alternative school and went to college because, like I was pregnant again. Like I was pregnant in my junior year and I was pregnant in my senior year. So, like I didn't just go right off to college, but I don't think that if I had a different experience there, if that experience hadn't happened to me, maybe that's a better way to put it. If that experience hadn't happened to me, if I had never been given, I'd never read John Irving before, I'd never read anything at that level of reading before. And if that hadn't been given to me and then shown to me so clearly that I had what it took, so to speak, I don't think I ever would have gone to college. But, later when my husband's like, so go to college. And I'm like, okay, let's go to college.
Let's do it.
So let's do it.
Here we go. I've already written my first paper about A Prayer for Owen Meany.
Right?
We're all set to go.
Yeah, and so that book now, I've reread A Prayer for Owen Meany 4 or 5 times in my life, and it always means something a little different. And like we talked about earlier, the books that grow with you, the stories that grow with you. And that's a story that has grown with me because I've, through education and through my life experiences now, I don't really fit with that old world that I come from, and I don't really fit with the new world that I'm going into. And so every time I read it, I identify with a different character.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Yeah.
As long as it's not like Mr. Fish who was run over by the diaper truck.
Right.
Like, I don't want to identify with him.
No, not okay. Not okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could be run over by penguins. I'd be okay with that, but not by a diaper truck.
Right, not by a diaper truck. Fair enough. Fair enough. Man, and which goes back right to what we started talking about in terms of like all the different layers, you know, reading a story on a Monday versus reading a story on a Friday, reading a story like, you know, to get your high school diploma versus reading a story when you're a college student versus reading a story when you're a doctoral candidate versus when you're a mom, you know, and like all these different levels.
Or just reading for pleasure.
Yeah.
You get something different.
Yep.
Yeah.
So good.
Yeah.
So good. Well, Larina, thank you so much.
Thank you
for
for
talking
you.
reading and writing, and this has been such a pleasure. Must readers, you can get more of fabulous Larina. She is speaking at TEDx Roseburg on July 29th, so coming right up. I will link to her TEDx talk once it's online, and you can get lots more about it. Speaking of layered meanings, her TEDx talk is all about, like, you know, TED talks about ideas worth spreading, and her idea is so moving and so powerful. Like, I really encourage all of you to check it out. So, TEDx,
Thank you.
Larina Warnock, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.